Good evening. Welcome back to Faith Baptist Church. Glad to have you with us again this evening. If you would get your hymn book, let's go to 329. 329 to start the service. There is power in the blood. If you're able to, let's stand and sing the first, second, and last verse.
Baptist Church. Thanks for being here on Sunday night and being in the Lord's house. We almost had to meet outside in the grass. There were 7 puppies on the property, and it just started growing, the congregation out there. And I thought Pastor was going to be preaching to an empty church house. But thank you for making it back in, and we'll have security keep an eye on them out there. But we appreciate you being here. And you know the Bible says, beware of dogs. It is in Philippians. It is my favorite verse. And so just be mindful of that with them on the premises. All right, we're going to open in prayer and look forward to a good time here of singing and worshiping and preaching tonight. I'm going to ask Matthew if he'll pray for us.
Father God, we do thank you so much for how you just helped us during revival, Lord God, that you met with us. I do pray, Lord, that we don't wait till next year to get excited about services and get excited about inviting. I pray there's a momentum built in hearts that we will continue to strive to reach people, Lord God. I do pray for our next upcoming event, first responder service. I pray that we will be involved in that, whether it's just praying for it as a church. But I pray that we just stay on fire for reaching this community to build this building that you graciously given to us. And I just pray for the message tonight, that we'll be helped by it. In Jesus' name.
Amen. You can be seated. We take that hymn book. Let's go to 738. 738, The Wonder of It All.
But the wonder of
continue 697. 697, The Way of the Cross Leads Home. I must needs go home by the way of the cross. There's no other way but this. I shall ne'er get sight of the gates of light if the way of the cross I miss. The way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is sweet to know as I onward go. The way of the cross leads home. I must needs go on in the blood sprinkled way, the path that the Savior trod. If I ever climb to the heights sublime, where the soul is at home with God, the way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is sweet to know as I onward go. The way of the cross leads home. Then I bid farewell to the way of the world, to walk in it nevermore. For my Lord says, come, and I seek my home, where he waits at the open door. The way of the cross leads home. The way of the cross leads home. It is sweet to know as I onward go. The way of the cross leads home.
All right, I'll have the ushers go ahead and come. If you have your bulletin handy, you can pull it out. But there's two dates. I asked you if you'd mark your calendar this morning, and then we have the wrong dates in here. So I don't want you to mark the wrong dates. That hayride, the October hayride for the teens is October 15th, and then for the church is October 16th. So thank you for those who caught that. So it's 15th and 16th. If you've been here for a while, you're familiar with it. It's a Friday night. And Saturday, the way it was, it looked like we were having an 11 o'clock hayride, and that might have been blasphemous. I don't know. On Sunday, that is. It looked like we were having an 11 o'clock hayride on Sunday. That's not the case. And then also want to tell you about this first responder service. And Matthew was praying about just keeping that zeal and that passion for God's house and inviting others. And this gives you an opportunity to do that. So our plan is to get into these places like the Cloverdale Police Department and the fire department there, and to get them a gift with the flyer, and that they can, a nice flyer, especially made for them, that they could put up with a gift to go with it, and then invite them. And I'm excited. I have a few people through our softball connection to work at the fire department and at the police station, so we'll be inviting them. But I hope you'll spread the word on that. That is coming up in just a few weeks, September the 26th, our first responder service. And I'm going to ask Rich if he'll pray for the offering.
Well, we miss Mr. Pitt. He brought a little life, and when he's not, we're almost like we're back to sleep. But it's good to have everybody with us tonight. And I hope you can say my sin's been paid in full. The Lord paid all of that, and we should never take that lightly. And I was just looking around. There's some things that always brings a smile to your face, and today I got one of those from Kinsley. Happy Grandparents' Day. Thanks for sticking with me. And I get a little plant like that. And so she did a one. When you've got 10 grandkids, you can't play favorites, but she's the only one that gave me this today, so today she's my favorite. And you can tell her that wherever she went. But we're excited about that. Thank you for being part of the service tonight. We are going to be in the book of Daniel tonight. Brother Price, I don't know what world he's in. He wanted to know, when are you going to get done with Psalms? What psalm are we in tonight? Did I not announce today we'd be in Daniel? But I don't know where he's probably back there watching Hallmark right now while we're up here. But we will get to, it'll be a little bit before we read the verses, but some of you remember that maybe you've read his biographies or things of a fellow by the name of David Livingstone. He was a very good, he was a doctor, he was an explorer, he was a very good missionary, and he was in Africa. He'd been there for some 12 years. And he wanted to travel from where he was on the east side over to the west through an area that no one else had been, no European had been, let's put it that way. And of course, David Livingstone's from England, if you didn't know that. And so he was wanting to go through there. He knew it was impossible for him to make it there on his own. And so he went to a local tribe chief, and he asked him if he could have 27 men to go with him. Well, the chief was a little bit suspicious, quite a bit suspicious, in fact, and he knew it was a very dangerous trip, and he also knew that most white men you could not trust, and so he was not really interested in that. And so Livingstone, realizing he was very reserved about this, he made him this promise. He said, if you give me your sons, I promise to return with them and to deliver them to their homes and their families. My life will be a pledge. And so on those terms, the chief finally agreed to let these men go. Well, the journey was just as dangerous as they had thought it would be, but they did finally get there to the west coast. I'm trying to see that I wrote down the port name, Port Luanda, I believe it's called, and that was their goal. And when they got there, they was kind of amazed that there was a British warship there. And there was even more ways when they found that warship had come from England looking for Livingstone. They'd sent him this ship to find him and bring him back by orders of Queen Victoria. The captain told him, said, Sir, Queen Victoria has sent me to urge you to return. All England is waiting to honor you. Now, in that day when the Queen invited someone to do something, it was more like a command, even though it sounded like a request. It was a command, and that's what he was to do. And so, with him thinking about how dangerous this trip had been and the fact that now he's got these people waiting to give him great honors, it must have been a temptation for him to go with them. But he had a problem. He had made a promise to an African chief on the other side of the continent that he would return. And these men on the ship, the men who come looking for him, they assured him the promise of a white man to an African does not matter. The queen is much more important to the chief. Well, it was tempting. I'm sure his story, when I read about his biography and think it doesn't say a lot about that, but he had made a commitment, and despite the urging of all these people and these officers, he turned around and he headed back into the jungle. And the round trip ended 2.5 years after it started. Now, you and I run from one side of Africa to another. We do it in a day on a plane or something, but they couldn't then. 2.5 years later, he got there. He delivered those people back to their homes. He was a man who put principle over honor, principle over acclaim, over people thinking they're somebody. Now, I know a lot of you went out today and patted me on top of the head, and that's all right. But there's principle there, and that's probably why when he died, and I looked this, I often think of these missionaries, and I seen his picture, and to me, he looks like a very old man. He died at age 60. I'm 62, so some of you say, Preacher, you look pretty old yourself. But a lot of these folks didn't live very long, and when they went out to the mission field, it was rough places. But when he died, they were committed to bury his heart in Africa. So they cut his heart out and buried it in Africa, and they sent his body came back home to be buried. But they was more than willing to listen to a man who could not be bought with promises of honor and promises of fame, but he stuck to his word. I tell that story because 2,400 years, somewhere around 2,400 years before David Livingstone made that choice, another man was promised great honor. Not by a queen this time, but by a king. If he could interpret a message that was written somehow in some miracle, it had just appeared on the wall in the king's banquet hall, if he could interpret that, he'll be made the third ruler in the kingdom. That'd be the third position. I don't know what that is in our government today, but I'm sure it's somewhere it has to land on Nancy Pelosi. Somehow she's always in line for something. But he would have been third. And this message on the wall was not a good message for the king. King Belshazzar is his name. Now, I know some of you saying, are you going to read it? I'm going to read way more than you want me to read here in just a little bit. But in my mind, the unspoken pressure of the moment. Now, this may be something you don't deal with, but I think everybody does sometime in their life. But the unspoken pressure of this moment might have been, don't tell the truth so you don't embarrass the king in front of all these people. So that man Daniel told that king Belshazzar, you keep your riches, keep your honors, I don't need them. And then, rather than bow to pressure, he did what he always did. He told the truth. He was committed to telling the truth. The story's in Daniel chapter 5, and I know you're there, and some of you probably read it while I was talking. But we're going to look at that this evening, and this is the fifth sermon in our thoughts that I've called When They Call for Something. In chapter 1, when they called for compromise. And again, we live in a world that's calling for something from us as Christians all the time. In chapter 2, they called for help. And of course, if you've not heard these sermons, they're still on YouTube, you can go back and listen to them, and there'll be a help to you, I hope. In chapter 3, they called for open-mindedness from Daniel. In chapter 4, they called for truth. And today, in chapter 5, I call it When They Call for Your Honor. All of us probably, sometime in our life, will be faced with the temptation to put honor, acclaim, something over principle at some point. It may be a junior high student who gives in and he's doing things that he knows is wrong, but it's going to make him kind of move up in the ladder, the social ladder, the peer acceptance there in his class. Or it could be the man who's offered the executive vice president position, but you got to keep your mouth kind of closed on some things that's went on behind closed doors, some scandals, some things like that. Those things happen all the time. It's amazing if sometimes when you hear it, and it happens in churches. There's a lot of things. And in fact, if I don't forget, I'll give you an illustration of something like that happened to a person I just talked to not long ago. But the temptation to place a position or a claim or some recognition over what is right, it happens at every stage of life. And that's what's going on with Daniel here. And many people give into it and sell themselves out before God. And I think you and I would do well to listen to what Daniel's got to tell us in chapter number 5 here. It's been, when this chapter opens, it's been some 20 years now since the end of the King Nebuchadnezzar. We read about him in the first 4 chapters, and during that 20 years, I'm told there's been several different people in leadership, and the morals of the country is going downhill fast. And the lesson that you remember, Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson after 7 years of being out in the field like an animal and eating like an animal and grazing, and his fingernails grew and all that. After 7 years of that, he learned that you can't disregard God. But everything that he had learned has been disregarded by these people and has been forgotten. No one thinks about that anymore. And because of the neglect and the pending judgment of God, Belshazzar, the king here in this chapter, he's a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, by the way. He's about to lose his kingdom. And at the time of these events here in chapter 5, the city is under siege. The Persians are outside, and they're trying to get in, but they're fully surrounded, but all the gates are locked and barred. Now, we don't have cities like that. I mean, if you want to get in Cunot, just come on in Cunot. We don't block it off. But cities in those days, they had walls, and you didn't get in. And if you didn't have walls, it wasn't really a city. But they had a massive wall surrounding this city, and it had state-of-the-art security. And it was impossible for an army to break through. And so, in fact, I read this. It said they had a 20-year food supply laid up. Now, I don't know what they had. They didn't have microwaves and stuff, and I don't know how you keep food for 20 years, but they had a 20-year food supply laid up. and they had the Euphrates River running in through it, through their whole city. So Belshazzar was very confident that he could just wait out this siege. These people's out there. Sure, I know the Persians are out there, but I don't have to go fight them. I don't have to do nothing. They're out there. We're in here. Sort of like you folks all locked in because of COVID. You get a little tiresome of it. Well, these people were just going to be locked in here until the Persians leave. But what he needed to do, he needed to rally people's morale. It's sort of like today. People get down. Some of you had to stay home for 2 or 3 weeks with COVID. Was it not depressing? It was. I mean, it didn't hurt us physically, but it gets in your mind. And so he's trying to boost morale a little bit, and so he puts on this big banquet, probably with the intent of doing like our politicians do today, to put a good spin on what's really going on. They throw out say all kinds of things when you can see what's happening and things is falling apart, and they're trying to say, boy, we are doing good here. Well, that's sort of what he was doing. And so now that we've said all of that, now we're going to start in verse number 1. And we are going to read quite a bit today, so stick with me. But verse number 1, the Bible says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, whiles he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines might drink therein. Then when they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, and his concubines drank in them, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. Now, we'll stop there, but what better way to show your nobles and all your people your confidence of what's going on than to mock the very God that your grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had accepted in the latter part of his reign? That's what he's doing. Nebuchadnezzar told people, you need to respect, don't say anything against this God, but now here's his grandson, and he's making fun of this God. He's mocking, he's worshiping the gods of brass and iron and wood and all this. And I picture it, if you remember the Philistines, remember when they poked out Samson's eyes and they brought him out to parade him around and brag about all they could do, and where's your God now protecting you? And they were making fun of him. Well, Belshazzar, that's hard for me to say, but he'd made fun of what he considered to be this little tin-horn God of the Hebrews. But little did he know that he was mocking the God of heaven for the last time. This was going to be his last day. This would be the last night for Belshazzar on this earth. Verse 5 says, in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand. Now remember, they're having a party. Now, I can honestly say this, and I'm glad I can say this. I've never drank, so I don't know what it does to people. Well, let me rephrase that. I've never drank. I don't know what it does to me. I can see what it does to other people. But I'm thinking to myself, if I'd been drinking about half the night and all of a sudden I seen a hand writing but nothing with it, I would think, I think I've had enough. I better quit drinking here. But he seen fingers of a hand's hand rolled over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace, and the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. Now, it's not funny when you read that. You always talk about people, my knees knock. Can I tell you, if you get scared enough, they honestly do that? And they did here. His knees was knocking together. Verse 7 says, the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing, and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now, if you just read through the book of Daniel, you will wonder why don't he call on Daniel? He knows Daniel. He's what a lot he's done. Well, like I said, it's been 20 years. He probably don't remember anything about Daniel. But word of this handwriting gets around. Now, they didn't have cell phones. They didn't have anything to communicate. But even in those days, just like today, something happens, people get word. Well, word got out to the queen, and I don't know if it was his mother or his grandmother, but whoever it was, there's no doubt she was around when Nebuchadnezzar was. And she remembered not only what Nebuchadnezzar, but she also remembered that fellow named Daniel. Verse 10 says, now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house, and the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. there's a man in thy kingdom. See, he didn't remember Daniel, but she did. So there's a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers, for as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams and showing of hard sentences and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show thee the interpretation. Now let me just say this, it keeps calling him thy father. That would be the same as we would say it's his grandfather, but they don't bother to say grandfather, great-grandfather, or second grandfather. They just say thy father. So he was in his line. So that she says, hey, call him. Verse 13 says, then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto him, art thou that Daniel, which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? Now think about this. I'll stop there. We'll start again. I'm still going to read a lot. What's he doing? He is mocking the God of Israel. He is making fun of everything. And who's he talking to right now? He said, are you the fellow that represents the God of Israel? Is there not irony there that he's forced to call on the prophet of God that he's just been mocking? And now he's scared and he's calling on that. You know what happens in life? People make fun of your God. People make fun of your church. They make fun of a lot of things. Then their life falls apart and they come looking for you. That's what they did with Daniel. Verse 14, I've even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I've heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now notice what he's promised here. Scarlet robe, that's a sign of great honor. You don't get that every day. A gold necklace, that's a sign of authority. A third ruler in the kingdom. I'd have to say that's not a bad promotion in anybody's court if you get knocked up to third place, third position. And now remember, here's the mood of everything. We're full of pride. We're arrogant. We're confident. Nobody can get through our walls. Nobody can hurt us. Nobody can do anything. That's what they've all been. And this city could keep any army out. And they knew that. And to this point, not one of Belshazzar's cabinet had any reason to think we're not safe. Not any one of them had any reason to think, you know what, our kingdom's about done. Nobody thought anything like that. And here's the point. Daniel, if he'd been like a lot of people, he knew all that. And he could have looked around and said, seen all that security, and he thought, you know what, this kingdom is pretty secure, and I've still got some years left in me, and that king's offered me the vice presidency, is what it's amount to, and maybe I ought to tell him that this message is a support for his gods. Maybe I ought to tell him, I certainly don't want to upset him in front of his nobles. Now again, the Bible doesn't say this is what happened, but this is what would go through most people's minds, and maybe it went through Daniel's mind. And for David Livingston, the gentleman I told you about at the beginning, it would have been equivalent to him getting on that ship and going back to England, turning his back on his principles. A claim over principle. But like Livingston, Daniel's principles were not for sale at any price. And so he tells him, verse 17, then Daniel answered and said before the king, let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. He couldn't be bought. Riches didn't mean anything to him. Honor didn't mean anything. And there's a lesson for us. Now again, this may be something, and I was intended to preach this morning, but it may be something you've already faced in life. Maybe you won't face it for a while, but it does catch up to us sometimes. And I am going to skip a few verses. Verse 18 down through verse 24, he goes back through, kind of recounts for Belshazzar the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar learned, which is simply this: you don't exalt yourself above your maker. Don't try to think you're better than God, because he'll put you down. And that's what Nebuchadnezzar learned that, and he's explaining that to Belshazzar. And then Daniel goes on and explains the hand. He says it was sent by God to give him a message. And the message is recorded here in verse 25. And this is the writing that was written, mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Now, I don't know if that was right or not. That's the best I could do. But this is interpretation of the thing. Many, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Perez, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet and put a chain of gold about his neck and made a proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, you know how long that lasted? One night, because it was all over here in a minute. In verse 30 it says, in that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Now, here's my thought. I haven't got to the sermon yet, and that's why some of you's worried. That's why I didn't preach this morning. Nobody would have come back tonight. But if Daniel was alive today, what do you think he'd say to you and I as Christians on this subject of principle? Principle before honor, principle before acclaim. What advice might he give us if we're facing a similar circumstance? I'm going to mention 4 things here tonight, and they won't take too long. The most part was in the first part. But the first thing I think he would say is, remember the real issue. It's easy in a situation like this to get our eyes on the wrong thing, get focused on what's not really going on, and forget what's going on with those people. Who is this that's trying to honor him anyhow? Us fine, upstanding citizens that's trying to do right? No, he could easily forget what they're asking him to do. And could I tell you, flattery can get you in a mess. It can be a heady thing, and you can lose sight of what's really going on. And I'll give you an example, ladies, men. Fellas, this was in Reader's Digest. It was good, and so I included it. But this fellow says this. He said, our minister was teaching on Proverbs 16:24, pleasant words are as a honeycomb, sweet to the soul and health to the bones. And then he added, the preacher said this, said, you can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. He said, about that time, my wife leaned over, put her head on my shoulder, and whispered in my ear, I just love to watch your muscles ripple when you take out the garbage. You see what I'm talking about? Flattery, being manipulated. So be careful of that. But now the issue is not always that cute. Think about this. It had to have been flattering for Daniel. He's an old man now. And most likely he's been, in active duty since Nebuchadnezzar died. He's probably staying at home. They're not calling him in. They're not asking for his advice. He's not doing anything. And now he's all of a sudden called back into the palace. And they're asking for his advice. And then for him to be a captive, a former just slave is all he was, to be offered the third position in the kingdom, that promise of honor, that promise of acclaim, it had to be something that was something you look at and pretty heady, if I say it that way, and it caused you to lose sight of your ideals. And what Daniel needed to remember in the midst of all this was that this same king that's hosting this dinner was the king that was mocking God just a few minutes ago. Be careful about that. My thought is, remember the real issue here. The real issue was this guy here he's not trying to help. He's not really help you. I don't know, did I put verse 2 and 3 back up there? I'm not going to read them again if I didn't, okay. But here's the king. He's tasting the wine. He's doing all this. He's mocking God. And now he's offering Daniel something here. Daniel needs to understand what's going on. And sure, that honor might be nice, but would you line up with pagans to get it? Would you participate in their blasphemy, blaspheming God? Would you mock and dishonor your own maker in order to be honored yourself? Is it worth that much, is what Daniel needed to understand. And you say, well, preacher, if you put it that way, nobody we shouldn't do that. But it's not always that clear. Sometimes there's a gray area. And I have people tell me things like this. There's some things are a little more gray area. Let me tell you what happens. The greater the promise of honor, the greater the promise of prestige, the grayer the area, because it pulls on you that much more. And that's what happens. And someone said this, and said, flattery looks like friendship, just like a wolf looks like a dog. I think there's some wisdom in that. And what I'm saying is we have to remember the real issue. Get your eyes off your own glory, and make sure you're still honoring and glorifying God when you're doing this. And again, it's a thought that maybe you'll not have to face, but we need to discern the issues. We need to know what's really going on when people offer you things. Don't let flattery blind you. So when you folks go out tonight and you pat me on top of the head, I'm still going to preach what the Lord tells me to preach next week, even if it makes you mad. And the second thing I think Daniel would tell us today, don't change the message. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I read this story, read this chapter, I don't see in there where it ever the Bible doesn't tell me everything, but it doesn't say in there and doesn't insinuate that Daniel ever even considered changing the message. But I'll tell you what, I know there's a lot of people in this world that would have. And it's easy to think about how certain circumstances it kind of pushes a temptation to change a little bit of what you're saying. Now, I think you need to use sense and tact about things, but we have to be careful that we don't change things. I talked to someone, and I can't remember who I was talking to, or if I read it, I don't remember. I just remember they was talking about a pastor who was after church, and he was with some other people, and he told kind of an off-color joke, which was not like him, and someone said something to him about it, and he said, well, God gives a little leeway after you've been in the ministry for a while. And it really set a fellow back. My thought is, don't change the message. Don't change what's going on. And Daniel could have changed the message. No one knew what this said except him. King didn't know it. None of the wise men know. Nobody else recognized it. He could have said it meant anything he wanted it to, and no one ever known the difference except God. So Daniel said, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to tell you exactly what it says. Now, they could have cut his head off as soon as he said that. The king could have said, I don't like what you said. I don't like the way you said it, and I'm just done with you. You're an old man. I'm gonna do you in. But he didn't do that. And but my thought is, what if you and I today feared God more than we fear man? I mean, we feared God to the point that we was afraid to ever change what God said. Just go with what God says. But people change it all the time. The New Testament warns us about changing the message for the sake of personal desires. Paul was writing to Timothy, and after he exhorted Timothy to preach the word, he said this. He said, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. Now, I'm not going to spend time on it tonight because I got a lot of notes, but could I tell you there's a fellow on TV that draws thousands and thousands and thousands of people on TV, not to mention thousands in his church. You know what he doesn't do? He doesn't tell people the truth. He tells them some truth. If you would ask him, can I stay with a Muslim religion and still go to heaven? He'd say, well, yeah. If you'd ask him you see, he don't want to hurt people's feelings, so he won't tell them the truth. Daniel wouldn't do that. And there's a lot today of conflicting teaching about Bible truth coming from everywhere. And there's a tendency to believe that a lot of that confusion is because the Bible's so hard to understand, and so it causes conflicts. But I suggest to you that it's probably not very often really is the Bible too hard to understand. It's just people want the Bible to say what they want to believe. And so I run across people, and they'll say, they'll tell different things. Well, I believe this. Well, it doesn't matter if I believe something. It's what the truth is what matters. I need to believe the truth. In fact, I just heard, I don't know where I heard it. I just heard it probably this afternoon somewhere. Two people talking, two ladies talking, and they said, we need to decide. How did they say it? It was comical the way they said, we need to decide what the truth is going to be. So in other words, we need to put this out. This whatever we want the truth to be is going to be the truth, not really what the truth is. And that's the way we live in our society today. Truth is what people make it, but that's not the way God is. And so Paul's warning here is that there's false teaching, and people's going to be wanting to gratify themselves, and we got to stand against that. And it happens in our day. So don't change the message. And it's again, there's a greater danger to us if we don't tell the truth than if we do tell the truth. Listen to what Ezekiel says. Ezekiel says this, Son of man, I have made thee a watchman unto the house of Israel. Therefore hear the word at my mouth, and give them warning from me. When I say unto the wicked, thou shalt surely die, and thou givest him not warning, nor speakest to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood will I require at thine hand. Yet if thou warn the wicked, and he turn not from his wickedness, nor from his wicked way, he shall die in his iniquity, but thou hast delivered thy soul. Now granted, this was spoken to a preacher, and I'll be honest with you, this message is more for me tonight than it is for you. Some of you are saying, good preacher, because I'm about ready to go home and let you have the rest of it anyhow. But it was spoken to a prophet, a preacher here. But I find it hard to believe that God would take distorting it any less serious today if you and I was to change his message. I think he still wants us to put out there. So he doesn't change his standards. God's standards stay the same. That brings me to my third thought. When they call for your honor, what would Daniel tell us today? Consider what's appropriate. Now, I say that because if you read this, back in chapter number 2, when we went with that chapter, Daniel was offered gifts and a reward and great honor. You know what he did? He took it. Now, granted, they give it to him here too, but he says you can keep it. He's not asking for it. But he didn't just take it back in chapter 2. He asked that his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego also be honored. And yet here, when the king promises him this, he says you can keep it. I've got verse 17. I'm not going to read it again. But what's the difference? Is Daniel inconsistent? I suggest the reason for the difference is the circumstances are different. Colossians chapter 4 says, let your speech be always with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how ye ought to answer every man. Could I tell you, one size doesn't fit all? Not everybody can you give the same answer to. That's why I don't like, sometimes in churches we try to make policies, and not everything, you can't just make a policy, say this is overall policy. You have to treat everything as an individual circumstance and see how it goes from there. And so not one size fits all when it comes to how we ought to respond when the world calls for honor. It may be appropriate. Brother McBride was in ministry 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. Just last year we went to celebrate. They kind of honored him for being in the ministry for 40 years. There's nothing wrong with that. So that was fine. And so sometimes you may accept that honor because it's a good thing, but on other times it may do damage to God's cause for us to accept it, so we need to step aside, which is what Daniel was trying to do here. And I think about back in Genesis chapter 14, you remember Sodom and Gomorrah, they was attacked by an invading army, and Abraham's nephew Lot was taken, and his family, they were survivors, but they was carried away when they looted the place and took people and took everything else. And when Abraham got word of it, that his relatives was taken captive, the Bible tells there, I think there was 318 men in his, not army men, but men that he had trained and servants of his, and they went out, and when he found these people that had taken him, he divided his men up into two forces, and he set up an ambush, and the result was he did what the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah couldn't do. He whooped these birds. And he brought them all, these people back. And when he got back, you'll remember Melchizedek there, if that's how I say it. The priest met him and blessed him. And Abraham gave the priest a tenth of all the things he had brought back as a tithe. And then the king of Sodom told him this. He said, you just keep the rest of it. For what you've done, said, you just keep everything else. And here's what Abraham said. He said, and Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up mine hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread, even unto a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I've made Abram rich. You see, Abraham, I'm not about to be obligated to a king who's doing everything wrong. And so Daniel's answer was, keep your gifts to yourself. Abraham's answer was, I'm not going to take anything that belongs to you. When is it appropriate, preacher? When is it not appropriate to take things? Well, let's say it this way. It's never appropriate to stand for honor and wait and look for honor when it's possible that the message is going to be compromised. If you have to take a step down and compromise the message, then forget it. It's not worth it. Let the honor go to somebody else. If there's going to be misunderstanding. So how does that fit? Well, we have to discern wisely the issues of honor and acclaim that's offered, and make sure that in no way is it causing a compromise. And again, there's a lot of things that people are honored for. We're going to honor first responders. There's nothing wrong with that. We're not asking anybody to take. I'm not going to put them in heaven when they come. If they're not saved, I'm going to preach to them just like everybody else. We're not going to compromise the message. Say, listen, because you guys saved lives, God's going to give you a grand old entrance into heaven. That's not true. But if you're saved, God will give you a grand entrance into heaven. And so we have to be careful we don't compromise that. And so it might be good for us to memorize what Daniel says, that let thy gifts be to thyself and give thy rewards to another, because there's going to come time in our life we may have to use that phrase, say, I can't accept this honor. I can't accept this reward. It's just not for me. And then one more thing that Daniel would say. I'm still going to get done in time. Some of you are worried about this. First, he would tell him, remember the real issue. Remember who these people really are. Next, don't change the message. Third, consider what is right. And if it's all right to take the honor and the things, then take it. And then third, or fourth, I think he would say this, you need to fear God's judgment. Remember, we've all used this phrase, the handwriting's on the wall. This is where it come from. When I say the handwriting's on the wall, this means that this is what's going to happen and everybody can see it. It's pretty obvious. Well, for Belshazzar, the handwriting on the wall was literal here. And it was figurative also. In fact, let me read. I got this out of a commentary back there. It says, Belshazzar had a false sense of security because the Persian army was outside Babylon's city walls. Their army was divided. Part was stationed where the river entered the city at the north, and the other part was positioned where the river exited from the city at the south. The army diverted the water north of the city by digging a canal from the river to a nearby lake. With the water diverted, its level receded, and the soldiers were able to enter in by going under the sluice gate. Since the walls were unguarded, the Persians, once inside the city, were able to conquer it without a fight. You see, they didn't even have many guards out because there was no way anybody could get in. And so that's what the commentary says had happened. They dried up the river, all that. But here's what God says happened. It says, in that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. What's that mean, preacher? You only get so much warnings in this life. I don't know. After so many warnings, the handwriting's on the wall, but there comes a time when the handwriting's over and it's time for us to pay. God will warn of a judgment so long, then the axe falls. We've got a Bible in front of us that's been warning us for years that God's coming back. It's been warning us of what happens when God's people walk away from God. And yet people still doing it. People are lost or still continue to pretend or act as though God's never going to come back and God's never going to judge them. And so it stands as a sign first to those who would mock God, as Belshazzar did. Even though Belshazzar had a clear testimony of what his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar went through, and he even had Daniel still there in his kingdom, he still wanted to mock God. And there are people today that all around you, people that work around you, and I hope that you're the influence for the Lord that you ought to be, but some of them, even though they see the Lord in you, they see Christ in you, they still stand rebellious against God and they don't care. And they might even mock God. What's going to happen? Someday God's not going to, their chance to be over. Someday God's going to withdraw, and that's why we need to pray for these folks. But it's also a warning that would cause you and I to fear God. When you and I are tempted to look at things and make adjustments so that we get honor, we get acclaim, and we set aside the principles that God has had us stand on. And my thought tonight is simply this: when the world calls for our honor, we need to remember the real issues. We need to resist the temptation to change the message. We need to consider what is the right response. Is this the right time for me to take this honor? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. And then remember the reality of judgment and fear God. Stand before God and do what's right. Now, when I was growing up in school, we had things called Aesop's Fables. I don't know if they still do them, but I've got one. And I want to end with this Aesop's Fable, and I'm just going to read it to you. And it says, a fox once saw a crow fly off with a piece of cheese in its beak and settle on a branch of a tree. That's for me, he said, as I'm a fox. And so he walked up to the foot of the tree and he says, good day, Madam Crow. He said, how well you're looking today, how glossy your feathers, how bright your eye. I feel sure your voice must surpass that of other birds just as your figure does. Let me hear but one song from you that I may greet you as the queen of birds. Flattery got to the old crow's head. Says the crow lifted up her head and began to call her best. But the moment she opened her mouth, the piece of cheese fell to the ground, only to be snapped up by the fox. That'll do, he said. That's all I wanted. So let me give you this in exchange for your cheese tonight. A little piece of advice. Be careful about flatterers. Be careful when you're at work. Be careful around people who would begin to brag on you and say things. It may be okay, but make sure it is, because it can get you in a mess. Daniel could have got himself in a real mess here. He could have said anything he wanted and no one would have ever known. But Daniel said, I'm going to tell the truth. And he stuck with the truth. When they call for your honor, always be honest. Would you bow with me for prayer? Father, we love you. Thank you again for your word. God, I pray you help us to realize that every day in this world, Satan's trying to find a way to make us fall. He's trying to find a way to cause us to take a shortcut that would dishonor you. He's trying to find a way to make us sin and go back on our word, and so people can't trust us. And he can't get us back. If we're saved, he can't get us out of that. We're always going to be saved, but he can make us of no use in this world, so we have no influence for Christ. And God, I've been in this church for a lot of years, and I can think of a lot of people that used to be part of this church that today, if they were to hand a tract to someone or walk up to someone and tell them about Christ, no one would listen to them because of their reputation. If they were ever saved, they still are, but God, they've lost things because they went for something. They went for honor, they went for something, but they put God aside. I pray, God, you'll help us to realize that flattery and things of those sorts can get us in a lot of trouble. God, help us stick to the truth and always stand for what's right. Bless during this invitation now. We'll thank you in Jesus' name. Amen. So stand.